The thing Master Sergeant Ryan Callahan said in the debriefing room at Fort Campbell on the morning of March 14th, 2003 took less than 4 seconds to say. The thing it cost him took the next 19 years to finish arriving. He was sitting at a long table in a briefing suite on the second floor of the 5th Special Forces Group Headquarters building. The room was lit by fluorescent tubes. There was a Pelican case on the floor behind his chair. In front of him, a formal after-action report, 17 pages, bound on the left edge by a single black spiral. Under the report, face down, was a separate sheet of paper. He did not mention the separate sheet during the briefing. The officers in the room did not know it was there. 3 men sat across from him. The senior of the 3 was Lieutenant Colonel Grant Bishop. Bishop was 44 years old, a 21-year veteran of U.S. Army Special Forces, with 2 rotations into Panama, 1 into Colombia, and by March 2003, 2 into Afghanistan. He had a reputation for brevity. He disliked meetings that ran long, and he disliked presentations that ran theatrical. He had worked with British operators in Kosovo in 1999, and he considered them capable, professional, and essentially comparable to his own people. Callahan had just returned from 6 months embedded with 22 SAS at Sterling Lines, Hereford. It was the standard exchange rotation. U.S. Army Special Forces sent a senior NCO. The British sent one of theirs the other direction, and both sides reported. Callahan had been the 4th exchange NCO from 5th SFG to do the rotation in 11 years. The previous 3 had written reports that said, in summary, that the British were good. Not better, good. Bishop had read Callahan's 17-page report in the 40 minutes before the briefing. He had underlined nothing. He was not expecting to hear anything that would require underlining. He asked Callahan for his bottom line. Callahan said it in 5 words: "We'd get our people killed." He said it clearly enough that everyone in the room heard every word. Bishop did not react for approximately 4 seconds. The other 2 officers, a major named Del Harmon and a captain named Lee Nakamura, looked at the table. Bishop then asked Callahan to clarify. Callahan did not clarify. He said the report contained the specifics. He said that if the colonel wanted to discuss the specifics, he would discuss them. Otherwise, he stood by the line. Bishop read the front page of the report again. Then he closed it. Then he told Callahan that his bottom line was not a bottom line. It was a provocation, and that provocations were not what after-action reports were for. He thanked Callahan for his service on the exchange. He made a note in the meeting log. He filed the report. The separate sheet of paper, face down, stayed under Callahan's hand the whole time. No one asked about it. The thing to understand about the exchange between U.S. Army Special Forces and 22 SAS is that it is not a training program. It is a presence program. An exchange NCO does not go to Hereford to be trained. He goes to be inside the unit for 6 months, to observe how it operates, to participate in selected elements of its work, and to return with his impressions. The British send someone the opposite direction for the same reason. Neither side treats the exchange as a teaching relationship. The assumption, across both professional communities, is that the exchange is between peers. This assumption is structural. It shapes what gets reported and what gets believed. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the American professional view of 22 SAS held most strongly among the officers who had worked with them in the Balkans and in Northern Ireland cooperation roles, was that the British regiment was small, technically skilled, slightly idiosyncratic in its internal culture, and essentially doing the same job the American side was doing, at a smaller scale. This view was not wrong in every particular. 22 SAS was small. In 2003, it had, operationally, 4 squadrons and fewer than 300 badged men across them. 5th Special Forces Group alone had roughly 1,400 personnel. Delta Force added several hundred more. The Rangers added several thousand. The raw numbers supported a specific kind of confidence. The British unit was a small outfit doing specialized work. The American units were specialized units doing work at the scale of a small army. What the American professional view did not account for was that 22 SAS was not trying to operate at scale. It was trying to operate at depth. Callahan did not understand this when he arrived at Sterling Lines in September 2002. He was 34 years old. He had been in Special Forces for 12 years. He had completed the Q course at Fort Bragg in 1991, served 2 rotations in Panama, 1 in Colombia, and had been on the ground in northern Afghanistan in the winter of 2001 and 2002. He spoke Arabic at a functional level and Russian at a conversational one. By the professional standards of his community, he was a finished product. He had nothing to prove to anyone in the British unit, and he was not going to Hereford to learn. He was going to observe. The first thing he observed was the quiet. Sterling Lines did not operate at the tempo he was used to. At Fort Campbell, NCOs moved between training blocks on compressed schedules: rifle work, demolitions, language sustainment, physical conditioning, mission planning. The week was tiled edge to edge with discrete training events, each of them accounted for in the unit's readiness metrics. There was almost no time in the working day that wasn't logged against a specific qualification. At Hereford, Callahan found that large stretches of the working day were unaccounted for in any formal sense. He did not initially understand what he was looking at. For the first 3 weeks, he assumed the unit was operating at reduced tempo for reasons he had not been briefed on. He expected the tempo to pick up. It did not pick up. What he eventually realized, and what the 17 pages of his report tried, in careful prose, to describe, was that the working day at Hereford was structured around a different theory of what preparation was. The American theory was that preparation was measurable. A man's readiness was the sum of his qualifications. If his qualifications were current, he was ready. The institutional apparatus at Fort Campbell and at every other American Special Operations installation was designed around the production and maintenance of measurable qualifications. This was not a bad theory. It produced reliable output. It allowed commanders to deploy units with confidence that the qualifications existed and were current. The British theory at Hereford was that preparation was unmeasurable. A man's readiness was a function of his judgment under conditions the institution could not fully specify in advance. Qualifications existed at Hereford, but they were not the product. They were the byproduct. Callahan spent his first 6 weeks at Hereford looking for the qualifications pipeline and not finding one. What he found instead was something he initially described in a letter to his wife as the least busy professional environment I have ever been inside. He revised that description later. It was not that the unit was less busy. It was that the unit's busyness was invisible to him because it did not match what he recognized as busyness. By late October, he began to see it. Worth noting here. The training Callahan eventually participated in was not unusual by Hereford standards. It was, by the testimony of the men who ran it, a slightly below-average cycle. Nothing about it was designed to impress the American observer. That was part of what eventually landed on him, the absence of any performance for his benefit. The report he wrote, in the end, contained 2 extended observations and a bottom line. The first observation was that the American Special Operations community had, by the early 2000s, built itself around a measurement infrastructure that was excellent at producing consistent output and poor at producing judgment. The men it produced were, on any given tactical task, extremely good. What it did not reliably produce were operators who could distinguish between tactical tasks, whose solutions they had practiced, and tactical tasks whose solutions they had to build. The second observation was that 22 SAS had, for historical reasons, Callahan did not fully diagnose, but did describe, built itself around the opposite premise. The institutional reward at Hereford ran off the rarer and more difficult skill. A man who could only execute the qualification was, at Hereford, still in training. The third thing in the report, not an observation, a conclusion, was the one Bishop read twice in the 40 minutes before the briefing, and did not underline. The conclusion was that in any operational environment where the problem could not be solved by executing a pre-practiced qualification, an American Special Operations Unit and a 22 SAS troop would produce categorically different outcomes. Not quantitatively different, categorically. Callahan wrote the word categorically in the report. It appeared once. He wrote in the same paragraph that on a qualification match task, an American Special Forces ODA and a 22 SAS patrol would perform within tolerances of each other. He wrote that on a non-qualification matched task, they would not. He did not write the word Iraq. Iraq was not yet the place his observation would land. In March 2003, Iraq was a coming operation, not a returned one. The professional community Callahan was addressing had not yet encountered, at scale, the kind of problem his report described. That was part of why the report was not believed. It was addressed to a community that had not yet seen the thing it described. The other part was Callahan himself. He was not, in the early months of 2003, a man whose judgment the institutional apparatus was predisposed to weight heavily. He was a 34-year-old master sergeant with no public accomplishments. He had not written a previous report that had been taken up. The institution had already metabolized him as a finished product with a standard output. The output it expected from him, on returning from Hereford, was the output it had received from his 3 predecessors. The British were good, not better. Good. When he produced a different output, the institution had 2 choices. It could take the output seriously, which would mean re-examining a framework it had spent 2 decades and a considerable fraction of its budget constructing. Or it could absorb the output as an anomaly produced by an individual whose experience had been unrepresentative. It chose the second option. It chose it without discussion. The specific moment that decided Callahan on the wording of his bottom line happened on November 4, 2002, in the parking area behind the Killing House at Sterling Lines, in the 90 seconds after a clearing exercise had ended. A Troop Sergeant Callahan knew only as Ken had just run a 4-man element through the standard close-quarters battle sequence in the second bay of the house. The sequence had gone clean. The paper targets had been hit in the correct sequence and with the correct number of rounds per target. Callahan, who had observed the sequence from the catwalk, would have signed it off as a qualification run at Fort Campbell without hesitation. Ken did not sign it off. In the parking area, with the 4 men standing in front of him, Ken asked the number 2 man of the element why he had moved to the left-hand side of the door frame on the entry. The number 2 man answered. Ken asked him whether he had looked at the left-hand side of the door frame before moving to it. The number 2 man answered that he had. Ken asked him what he had seen. The number 2 man answered that he had seen a clear frame and a clear floor. Ken said, "There was a hinge." The number 2 man said nothing. Ken said, "The door opened inward. The hinge was on the left," which meant the door, if it had been swinging, would have swung into the left-hand side of the frame, which meant the left-hand side of the frame was the last place you wanted to be if the door was unsecured, which it was because nobody had secured it. The number 2 man said nothing. Ken said, "We don't train for hinges. We train for you to see hinges." Callahan wrote that sentence in his notebook that evening and circled it. It was the sentence that, in his view, contained the whole of what he was trying to describe. The American infrastructure trained for the correct move on the correct door. The British infrastructure trained for the capacity to recognize, before the move, what kind of door it was. He knew that if he wrote exactly this sentence in his report, it would not land. It would read as stylistic observation, which is what reports that contain stylistic observations read as inside the institutional apparatus that receives them. It would be filed under cultural note. It would be absorbed as a quirk. He had to write something blunter. He compressed the blunter thing that morning at 06:30 in the small office with the radiator that ran too hot. He compressed it for Bishop because he knew Bishop would not read past the first page of the report. He compressed it correctly. Bishop did not read past the first page of the report. The Welsh Borders reconnaissance Callahan had observed in late January 2003 was, in the briefing pack that described it, a routine exercise. The task was described in one line. A 4-man patrol would be inserted by vehicle at a road junction 8 kilometers south of a designated observation point. The patrol would move to the observation point on foot, establish a hide, maintain the hide for 72 hours, and extract on foot to a pickup 12 kilometers to the east. The terrain was open. That was the central problem. There was no wood cover for the final 2 kilometers into the observation point. The hide location was in a fold of ground that would conceal a man lying flat with reasonable kit, but would not conceal him with any substantial redundancy. The extraction route crossed 2 minor watercourses and a road used at night by agricultural vehicles. Callahan, looking at the map, would have committed a company minus to the task. At minimum, he would have sent a reinforced squad of 9 to 12 men. The British were sending 4. He asked privately about this. The squadron commander was a major named Philip Lockett. Lockett was 38, had served in 22 SAS for 11 years, and had commanded squadrons in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. Lockett listened to Callahan's question, looked at him for slightly too long a second, and said the line Callahan wrote down verbatim. "Because that's how many we need." Callahan asked what would happen if the patrol was compromised. Lockett said, "They'd move." Callahan asked where. Lockett said, "Wherever they needed to." That was the conversation. Lockett went back to reviewing the insertion graphic. Callahan went back to his notebook. The patrol inserted on the evening of January 22nd. It reached the hide at approximately 0410 on January 23rd. It maintained the hide for 71 hours and 20 minutes. It exfiltrated on foot and was recovered on the evening of January 26th at the designated pickup. It returned its observation log. It was debriefed the following morning in a room Callahan was permitted to sit in. The debrief lasted 40 minutes. 8 minutes covered what the patrol had observed. The remaining 32 minutes covered what the patrol had done during the 2.5 days that the log showed them as stationary. The log showed them as stationary because the patrol had not moved in any way the log was designed to record. They had not shifted position. They had not engaged. They had not made contact. What the 32 minutes covered was the set of decisions the patrol had considered and rejected during the 71 hours. At hour 14, a farmer had walked a fence line 300 meters from their position, and the patrol had considered withdrawal to a secondary hide. They had assessed the farmer's behavior as routine. At hour 29, a military vehicle had traveled the road to their north, and they had considered whether the route was being cleared ahead of a later movement. At hour 48, one of the patrol had begun running a low-grade fever, and they had considered extraction. At hour 61, visibility had dropped, and they had considered relocating the hide. At hour 67, a helicopter had overflown at altitude, and they had considered whether their signature had been spotted. Each of these considerations had been resolved internally by the patrol, without communication to base, and without any log entry that indicated they had occurred. The log showed them as stationary. What they had actually done, in Callahan's notebook that evening, was work. 40 minutes of debrief had surfaced, what the log could not. The patrol had been making continuous operational decisions for 71 hours. The decisions were invisible because none of them had resulted in action. The correctness of the decisions, the fact that none of them had resulted in action, was the work. This was the form of work that Callahan's institution could not see. He sat through the debrief without speaking. At the end of it, Lockett asked him if he had questions. He said no. He went back to his office and did not open his notebook. He did not open it for 3 days. The second extended episode in Callahan's report was a close quarters exercise he had been invited to participate in personally on February 11, 2003, in his 6th month at Hereford. The exercise was a hostage rescue in a building complex the regiment had built to simulate a commercial office on 3 floors. Callahan was placed in a 4-man element with 3 SAS operators he had worked with for most of his rotation. He was given the role of number 3. The scenario was a single hostage in an interior room on the 2nd floor, 3 armed guards distributed across 3 rooms, and an unknown quantity of civilian personnel on the ground floor, who the element was to avoid engaging. The element entered the building at 14:22. They cleared the ground floor in 38 seconds. They moved to the 2nd floor in an additional 19 seconds. They cleared the first 2 rooms on the 2nd floor in a combined 22 seconds. They reached the hostage room at 1,424 and 37 seconds. They neutralized the final guard. They recovered the hostage. They exited the building at 1,425 and 58 seconds. The element's total time was 1 minute and 58 seconds. By Fort Campbell standards, the run was excellent. Callahan left the killing house that afternoon believing he had finally seen the inside of what 22 SAS did, and that, in the specific instance of a pre-briefed hostage rescue, his own training matched theirs. This was the moment he almost did not write the report. For 3 days after the 11th of February exercise, Callahan considered that his earlier observations had been overread. He had been, he told himself, influenced by the reconnaissance debrief in a way that had tilted his thinking. The reconnaissance task was, by definition, the kind of task that exposed doctrinal difference most sharply. A hostage rescue was not. A hostage rescue was a qualification task. His unit trained for it. Hereford trained for it. On a qualification task, the 2 forces operated within tolerances of each other. He began drafting a softer version of the report. He drafted it for 2 days. Then, on February 14th, the squadron ran the same hostage scenario with a different element, and he observed it from the catwalk. The second element, also 4 men, also entered at 14:22. They did not clear the ground floor in 38 seconds. They spent 1 minute and 14 seconds on the ground floor. They did not move to the second floor until 1,423 and 36 seconds. They moved to the second floor, paused on the landing for 18 seconds, and then did something that was not in the scenario. They re-entered the ground floor from a different stairwell. They re-cleared 2 rooms they had already cleared. They then moved to the second floor again, this time via a service corridor Callahan had not previously registered as an access route. They recovered the hostage at 1,427 and 11 seconds. Their total time was 5 minutes and 11 seconds. From the catwalk, Callahan had watched what looked like a worse run. The element had taken 2.5 times as long. They had backtracked. They had broken the flow of the sequence. The debrief afterward explained what they had done. On the first ground floor sweep, the element's number 2 had observed that one of the civilian role players on the ground floor was not where the briefing had placed them. The player had moved approximately 4 meters from their briefed position, a detail that, in a real scenario, would indicate the civilian had chosen to move for a reason that could not be known in advance. The element had assessed that the deviation was non-trivial. They had re-entered because the deviation indicated an unknown, and the standard response to an unknown of that magnitude was to re-establish ground truth. They had added 3 minutes and 13 seconds to their time to verify that the ground floor was what they had been told it was. On a qualification metric, the run was worse. On the metric, Callahan's report was trying to describe the run was the one that would have saved the team. On the evening of February 14th, Callahan walked across the compound to Ken's office. The office was small. There was a desk and a chair and a kettle on a shelf. Ken was reading a piece of paper. Callahan asked him if the 14th of February run had been designed as a teaching run for the element, or as a teaching run for Callahan. Ken did not look up from the paper. He said, "For the element, you watching it was incidental." Callahan asked him whether the regiment ran a standardized evaluation that graded the 14th of February run against the 11th of February run. Ken said, "Not in a way you'd recognize." Callahan asked him how the regiment decided whether an element was ready. Ken put the paper down. He looked at Callahan for a long moment. He said, "We don't." He said, "They decide. Each of them decides when to stop asking if they're ready. That's what readiness is." Callahan walked back to his office and opened his notebook and wrote on a fresh page, "There is no measurement that produces what they produce. The thing they produce is produced by not measuring." He closed the notebook. Then, from the back of the drawer, he took a single sheet of paper. He put it in the typewriter the office had been furnished with. He typed one line. What exactly he typed has been described different ways by the 2 people who have claimed to have read the sheet since. The most consistent account is that it said, "In the environment we are walking toward, my people will die faster than I can replace them, and I have no framework to give the colonel that will make him understand why." He pulled the sheet from the typewriter. He did not read it. He placed it, face down, in a manila folder. The folder went into his kit. It traveled with him on the flight to Washington on March 10th. It was under the 17-page report when he placed both on the table in the briefing suite at Fort Campbell on the morning of March 14th. Bishop did not ask about the folder. No one did. Bishop filed the report on the afternoon of March 14th, 2003. The report was assigned a Standard Exchange Program archival code and moved by an administrative clerk named Karen Daly to the records room in the basement of the 5th Special Forces Group headquarters. It was filed in a brown manila folder under Callahan's service number and the exchange rotation identifier. It was not flagged. It was not summarized. It was not circulated. Callahan left 5th SFG in the second week of May. He put in his retirement paperwork on May 9th and processed out on May 23rd. He did not discuss the report with anyone after 14th March. 2 of the 3 officers who had been in the briefing deployed to Iraq within the year. Nakamura was killed on February 23, 2005, in a house in western Ramadi during a clearing operation in which the target of the clearance was not where the briefing had placed the target. The clearance was conducted at standard speed. The team that conducted it did not re-enter the building before moving upstairs. The target, who had repositioned, was in the stairwell. Harmon survived. Whether Harmon, at any point in the years that followed, connected the house in Ramadi to the briefing suite at Fort Campbell has never been recorded. He retired in 2011. He was interviewed twice by Army historians. Neither interview mentioned Callahan by name. The report, all 17 pages of it, remained in the records room at Fort Campbell through the rest of 2003, through 2004, through 2005, through the period in Iraq during which the operational environment Callahan had described was, repeatedly, encountered. 2 people pulled the file in the 14 years that followed. Neither of them read past page 3. The single sheet of paper, face down in the manila folder under the report, was never separated from the folder by the clerk who filed it. It remained inside the folder, under the report, folded once by the weight of the stack on top of it. In 2017, the records room was digitized. The report was scanned. The single sheet was scanned alongside it, still face down in the folder. The scanner operator was working through a queue of approximately 14,000 documents. She scanned the sheet the way it had been filed. She did not turn it over. The scan of the single sheet in the 5th Special Forces Group Exchange Archive shows a blank piece of paper. The line Callahan typed on February 14, 2003 is on the other side of that scan. Callahan died in Asheville, North Carolina, in November 2022. He was 54. The cause of death was cardiac. He left no written statement about Hereford. He left no written statement about Iraq. The manila folder remained in the archive. The folder is still there. The sheet is still face down. The line has never been read.